Hi, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is part of my webinar series where I am looking at various topics and expanding the understanding of health diseases from a perspective of COVID. Really important areas that we have to cover. And so today I'm talking about the gluten intolerance, the hidden epidemic, and why is it occurring? So, if you're joining me here on YouTube, you will see the first part of the presentation, but it's really for the webinar registrants. So, you need to look out for these webinars in the near future. And we'll jump into it in just about a minute. But just to remind you, as usual, that you need to join us in this journey with regards to disease X. Are you prepared against disease X? So this is our book, and we're looking at launching it very soon. The pre-order is already on Amazon as a pre-order. You can get a preview of it right there. So if you go to the landing page that will be in the description afterwards, you can get a preview and join us in this journey. We want this to get to number one, and I think this is a great book. And I'm saying that from my own perspective, I guess. But the point is that I really would appreciate the support. So yes, please, if you are thinking of joining us in that journey, definitely we are very, very appreciative of the support. So let's get straight into this presentation and look at what I think is going to be a rising issue over the next decade because COVID is still circulating, especially in highly vaccinated regions. And so it is something that really needs to be considered. So let's get straight into this presentation here. So, the gluten intolerance, the hidden epidemic you never knew about. This is a big topic. And as usual, I'd like to remind you that this is for information only. So it can't represent or replicate professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. And so this information here, you can take it, you can discuss it with your doctor. But if you are sick, please make sure you go to your doctor. So, what we're trying to cover here, and you'll see the first part of this, is just some key learning objectives in terms of gluten and what is it here and gluten related disorders. What happens when wheat is processed? Now, this is a biggie. This is probably the secret in terms of why I think we're seeing this. And this was occurring before we had the pandemic. But then I'll be integrating it to explain why the COVID pandemic is going to make it even worse. And then potential strategies to address this. So, this is actually a really, really important area that we're covering. And hopefully, at the end of it, people would have learned some very valuable principles and techniques about the health. Gluten is not inherently harmful for most people, but it can be harmful for those with gluten related disorders. This is a really simple principle. And something that I emphasize all the time is that just because somebody hasn't had any impacts about something doesn't mean that it's not a serious problem across the population. And gluten is one of those where it is a percentage of people who are affected. And what we have to try and figure out is for those who are affected, what can be done about it. But what really is gluten? Here we have gluten really is from wheat, and it is the protein base from the wheat. And I'll break it down some more. But it's composed really of two specific proteins here, gliadin and glutenin. And the two together make gluten. And depending on which kind of wheat crop it is, will determine the concentration of each one of these proteins and the way how it is used. And you have to remember that wheat is an integral part of what we do in our daily lives, especially in the Western world. So, what really is the composition of wheat? When you break it down, and this was taken from the paper "What is Gluten?" Journal of Gastroenterology and Hepatology, you have here the wheat kernel. That's what you would get in the wheat, the plant or the fruit or whatever you call it at the end. It's composed of 60 to 70% starch. The protein here is 8 to 15%, depending on what type of wheat it is. Then you have moisture content up to 15%, small amount of lipids, small amount of ash. The protein in it can then be broken down into albumin and globulin, which is 10 to 15%, and gluten, which is 85 to 90%, of which you can have a 50-50 split of the gliadin and the glutenin. And when we talk about wheat related disorders, we are focused primarily on this gliadin. And this protein seems to be the central part as to what is occurring in causing significant disease. And when people think of gluten, they oftentimes can't quite remember what it is that we are talking about. And here you have all of the different kinds of wheat related foods that you have around you. And this is where we've broken it down into different categories based on the concentration of wheat. Here you have the common food items. And at the top of the list, with high gluten content, you have bread, pizza, pasta, bagels. And bagels, depending, because they are chewy, will determine, depending on what texture you want them to have, it will determine how much gluten you have in it, because gluten tends to make the baked products a bit more chewy. And so you have all of these have high levels of gluten. Medium levels are things like breakfast cereal, couscous, and rye bread. And then low levels of gluten, beer, sausages, the sauces that you can have in soups, and so on. And this is important because for people who are really sensitive to gluten, say for instance, if they had celiac disease or something like that, they would have to try and stay away from all forms of gluten. And what you may find is that some people are quite fine with some of the low level stuff, but the minute they start to go up in terms of the gluten content, they start to have a lot of symptoms. And this is an important part as to how the body will end up coping with this kind of issue. And then you have a full breakdown of the different kinds of gluten issues that you can have. And here we have, because not everybody is at one end of the spectrum. So when we look at this, and this is again from the same paper, What is Gluten? Journal of Gastroenterology and Hepatology, and when you look at the gluten or wheat related disorders, you have the autoimmune ones, for which celiac disease is the most commonly known. That's where people have lots of gut issues. But you can also have gluten ataxia, and this is where one of the enzymes that breaks down gluten also gets in the brain and does damage there. Similar thing can happen here with dermatitis herpetiformis, where they have skin lesions. All of those are autoimmune characteristics with gluten. You can also have an allergic response where you get more like wheals or rashes in relation to gluten, and that's the wheat allergy. And then you have the other section, which is not autoimmune, not allergic, but a sensitivity, but it still seems to be immune related. And it's all related to the complexity of the immune system and the way how your immune system interacts with the environment. And so this is why it's important. Many people get confused and they'll say, I don't have a gluten problem because I don't have celiac disease. This is a specific blood test we look for with celiac disease. And I said, well, just because you don't have celiac disease doesn't mean that you don't have a gluten related issue. And that's why I emphasize to people, follow your symptoms. Don't just assume that because a blood test is negative that you don't have anything. Even though you're having bloating, diarrhea symptoms, you've got to be practical about what is going on. And in terms of the mechanism around what happens, this is now a little bit of the pathology around these gluten related immune disorders, is essentially showing you here. This is the bread, which has come from wheat. And this is an example of what the gliadin molecule would look like. So it's a protein, and normally it's acted on, especially in the stomach, by proteases. These are enzymes to break it down, cutting it up into little bits, which are then cut up even further. But then what happens is that when the body is struggling to process it, it can do process we call deamination, where they take away some of the ammonia on some of the specific amino acids. And then these deaminated gluten peptides are immunogenic. And then what they do is that they interact with the immune system. And these are dendritic cells that are in the gut. These dendritic cells will then present them to CD4 cells, which then activate other B cells to produce antibodies and activate CD4 cells to produce cytokines. And this whole process, this autoimmune process, can occur. And that's the genesis of celiac disease. But if you imagine that this process has been activated, but it is not necessarily occurring with autoantibodies, but it may have some activated cells with cytokines. This is the pattern for the non autoimmune mechanism that I think we're going to see huge amounts of over the next 5 to 10 years. And I'll be explaining how it's connected with regards to COVID. And what a lot of people don't get, especially people who are struggling with fatigue, and the people who are struggling with fatigue can't quite understand how important this is in terms of the point of their symptoms. This is a breakdown slide that I've used to show just how the inflammation in the intestine, because of these immune cells producing gamma interferon, this action, because it needs to shut down the immune inflammatory process in the body, it makes the intestines not absorb tryptophan. And by not absorbing tryptophan, that then has knock on effects, because tryptophan is needed for serotonin, which is for mood, it's needed for melatonin, which is for sleep, but it's also an integral part of the production of carnitine, which is critical in making ATP, and also niacin, which is also critical in making ATP. And so you have this problem here where the mitochondria in the cells can't produce enough ATP. So the muscles have to depend more on glucose because it can't use fats. People are fatigued. And this whole cycle is coming from that inflammatory process in the gut. So many people don't even know why they're feeling so unwell, why they're feeling so fatigued all the time. And they underestimate the link in relation to their gut inflammation. And because gluten is one of the most common irritants or allergens in your diet, if you don't take it into consideration, it's going to make you sick without you even knowing. So, what I'll be completing, so for the people who are not on the webinar, by the time we're finished, we would have covered the relevance of wheat processing, how pesticides fit and overlap in this, the gut dysbiosis that was there before, bacterial toxins, and intestinal inflammation from COVID, and how all of this interacts to increase the gluten intolerance that we are already seeing across the population. So it's important to note that these points are very, very critical. And as I said, gluten is not inherently bad for most people. But for people who have gluten related disorders, it can be very harmful. The challenge is for you to recognize what that is. And the principle is simple. Please don't ignore your gut. If you are having symptoms that are gut related, you have got to ensure that it's not your diet that is making you sick. Really important part of the puzzle. And so, thank you very much for our YouTube audience. Thank you very much for being with us. For our other webinar attendees, we'll hear the full presentation. Look out for the link afterwards. And don't forget the fact that Disease X, join us in this journey. As you can see, we're taking the science, we're breaking it down, we're taking all of COVID because, in effect, as somebody asked me, why are you talking about Disease X when there is COVID floating around? Well, here is the principle that I usually say. Principle is simple. I don't think that we're going to see another virus that's as versatile as SARS-CoV-2. So we are dealing with one of the most effective viruses at causing a pandemic and making people sick. If we figure out how to protect you against it, you'll be protected against most other things. Maybe not everything, but most other things that can be thrown at you. That's why you need to learn about it. So, again, for the YouTube audience, thank you for joining me. And for the rest of the webinar attendees, please stay with me as we continue the process. Have a great evening.